Hi yogis, thank you for joining me for this yoga sizzle video. So in this deconstructing asana video, we're looking at the famous triangle pose. In Sanskrit, it's called Trikonasana. It's a lot of straight lines and angles, and I feel like it creates a lot of space inside. So I love doing this pose, but I will admit when I started yoga, I found it super hard. What does it look like? Well, you've got your straight lines, you've got triangles between the legs, you've got triangles between the leg and the arm. So lots of lines, lots of angles. And what, if we go a little deeper, a little closer, what's actually happening in the body? So if we start with, we're going to have the right leg as the front leg. The toes point to the top of the mat. But you want a sensation of external rotation in this front thigh. You see, we have in the thigh bones, there's a bony knob that protrudes. And by turning the thigh, externally rotating the thigh, turning your toes to the top of the mat, you create a bit more space because that gets turned out to the side. So it's a little easier to tilt from the hips. If you do this pose and you hear a clunk, it means that you need to externally rotate your thigh just a little more to make that space. So your legs are going to be straight. The back toes are going to be angled slightly, similar for Warrior Two and the side lunges. Essentially, it comes from a side lunge position because the hips and the pelvis need to be angled slightly. So the legs are straight, front toes pointing forward, back toes angled to accommodate the angling of the pelvis and helping to externally rotate that front thigh. Watch that you don't lift the big toe, so keep the big toe down. The pelvis stays neutral to begin with. Your spine stays perpendicular to the pelvis. So this is a hip opening posture. It's for the pelvis, it's for the hips. So to move into it, keeping the spine straight, you could even try holding a broomstick. You tilt on the hips and you keep the spine straight. In the beginning, it can be really interesting to explore the sensation by holding onto the hips and just tilting. And if you feel very tight in the hips, you might not get more than to here. And that's fine. Then you can extend the arms to shoulder height and your triangle pose might look like this. If your neck feels okay, you can look up to the top hand or you can look down to the bottom hand. If your hips feel like they can go a little deeper, you still tilt at the hips. So you're deepening the crease at the front groin. You'll feel that begins to stretch more and more into the groin muscles of the front leg, may end a little into the hamstrings, but you keep the spine straight. So it's perpendicular to the pelvis. And then the arms out to the side. The buttocks muscles, of course, working to stabilize. The front buttocks, so the right buttocks, helping to externally rotate the front leg. And the buttocks of the back leg, helping to stabilize the pelvis and give that slight hip extension. And it's going to be it's really good for bikini season because you really build up strength into this top side of the body because that's what supports the spine and keeps the spine perpendicular to the pelvis. And maybe if you reach the hand onto the leg, be careful you don't collapse down because see, the spine isn't perpendicular anymore. Now it's like a sloppy spaghetti. So a really good way to avoid sloppy spaghetti spine is firm grip of the leg and then pull up. That will help switch this on. You can also test your own strength, bring your hand to the inside of the leg and then pushing your hand against the leg, reining in the ribs, reining in the sit bones, and then turning the entire rib cage up to look. And then little by little, as your hip mobility increases, you might be able to come deeper and deeper. But remember, it's from the pelvis and the hips, not at the spine. Be careful that you don't hyperextend the legs. You want to keep the knee joints a little soft. That way the muscles of your legs are going to work and you'll build more strength too. So traditionally, a lot of yoga teachers were instructing this pose as if to imagine you were practicing between two panes of glass. The hips square to the side. But what happens when we square the hips to the side? It's a little more obvious in something like Warrior Two. If you try to square the hips, you pull the front knee in. When the legs are straight, you still pull the knee in, and you put a lot of pressure into the knee joint if you try and square the hips. Because of our hip openings and that they don't poke out to the side, we can't practice between two panes of glass. So there needs to be that angle. But you can try with the muscular effort to lift the hip up as you externally rotate the front leg. So then you'll get a sensation of opening into the front groin, more stretch into the hamstrings and the adductor muscles, and you might feel that lift up. But that's muscular effort. That's not forcing joints against their range of motion and putting pressure on something that's a little bit more vulnerable, like the knee. Another common cue that I've come across is, and I think it comes from wanting to maintain this straight spine, and so some teachers will cue to reach out. But as you can see, my hips haven't moved, just the spine, and that's what it does. It skews on your vertebra. So if you imagine your vertebra like building blocks, if you just reach out without moving at the hips, you're just going to pull, or shear rather, you're going to shear the vertebra. And that's going to put a lot of pressure and can in some instances be quite painful. So this triangle pose is about getting into the hips. So if you know that you might be a bit of a spaghetti spine person, don't worry. You can try keeping your arm up rather than out to the side. Keep your arm up. Keep the side body long and then tilt. However, because you've got a longer lever, this is going to be even stronger on your core. You still want to be externally rotating the front thigh, anchoring through the big toe, and tilting at the hips. So if you want to go really crazy, this is triangle pose with train track arms, really strong on the core. But if you tilt at the hips, you avoid shearing of the spine. So play around with that. In the beginning, you might even like to just try and tilt the hips. Notice what it's like, having the toes parallel and then tilting the hips. You can't come down as far because of that bony knob on the thigh bones. The lesser or the greater trochanter, I think it's called. So that's why when you externally rotate the front thigh, you've got a bigger range of motion. I sometimes refer to it as a little bit of a twerk. You just want to isolate the pelvis. So have a look at that. Give your hips and your pelvis a little bit of a movement. If you're fairly new to the practice, stay up high. Remember, your practice can be here. It can be hands on the hips if the arms out to the side feels very strong. And then you slowly explore, letting the level of hip mobility help you into the pose. I really like this practice of holding onto the leg and trying to pull up. And some might be very close to the floor, so you just use a block to bring the floor a little closer. And then you slowly turn the block. You can have your hand to the inside. You can have the hand to the outside. Now in Iyengar yoga, the alignment cue is usually lining up the wrist of outstretched arms with your ankles, and then bring your hand down to the leg. In Ashtanga yoga, it's a slightly narrower stance, where you hold onto the big toe. And you'll notice that this becomes even more of a hamstring stretch, whereas the Iyengar version becomes a bit more hip focused. But if you hold onto the big toe and then stretch your arm out, then you rein in the ribs, tuck in the sit bone, and open up. You'll also notice this version is also really nice for stretching the outer hip on the top side. So, play around with your triangle, make some pretty shapes, and I hope you enjoy. See you again soon. Namaste.